It has been more than a year since you left prison.
Yes.
What have you been surprised by, shocked by, in terms of what America and the world is like?
Oh, wow.
Since you were last out and about.
So when I first heard I was getting out of prison, I thought, I'm going to go home, I'm going to rest, relax, almost retire. That was kind of what I was imagining, was a bit of a retirement, riding off into the sunset, end of the story. But whenever I got outside and I started to see what's changed, I really started to realize that many of the things that drove me, into activism in the first place, into doing things a decade ago, have really intensified. It's like somebody hit the gas pedal in the last few years, and many of the things that I feared would happen have largely happened with the rise of authoritarianism, the rise of the military, intelligence, and police state that we now live in, and the sort of rise of nationalism that's much more intense and hateful.
Ultimately, why did you become a whistleblower?
When I first encountered what it was to be in a foreign country and and being an occupying force in a foreign country, and to see the complexities of war, and to really there was no way I could have known beforehand except seeing it all, and I really want people to know and understand that and see what we were seeing. And I think that was, above all else, a driver.
You wanted your fellow Americans to see the people in Iraq that you were seeing. Do you think you achieved that ultimately?
Well, I also wanted history to see. This isn't just about, America in 2010. This is about the world for the rest of history. And many times throughout history, we've gone through these kinds of things, and some of the history has been lost, and we have to find it again. And I wanted to ensure that wouldn't be the case here.
I mean, you definitely made your mark on history. That must have been quite difficult, though, at quite a young age, to both be lionized as a hero and villainized by those who were angry at what you did.
I never really had the chance to think about that, because I went straight into solitary confinement. I didn't even know for 2 months whether or not I was, whether or not, anything had happened. So it really has been for me more of a struggle for survival. That was what those 7 years were, especially as a trans person in prison, and as somebody who, I see what's happening and I want to do something about it. And so I really focused on the day-to-day, and on, one of the things for survival is breaking it down into smaller bits and pieces. I would wake up, it would be breakfast, I would eat breakfast, then it would be lunch, and I would eat lunch, I would eat dinner, and then I would go to sleep. So it's very much a breakfast, lunch, dinner, sleep, breakfast, lunch, dinner, sleep kind of schedule that is what got me through.
What was the most difficult aspect of those 7 years?
It was probably having to fight every single day for just basic necessities like healthcare, or I fought for hormones, I fought for surgery. We would often have to band together, to go, to defend ourselves from, often, very intense scrutiny by guards.
You mentioned being a trans prisoner. There were particular challenges that you faced. I know that, for instance, not being able to grow your hair was something that really mattered. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
It's one thing for you to be seen as a human being, and it's another thing for somebody to tell you on a piece of paper that you have access to some rights but not others. That's one of the reasons why whenever I wasn't given a guarantee that I was going to get access to surgery, that I eventually went on a hunger strike, because that was me asserting myself and my humanity and my identity and being like, no, I'm not just a piece of paper. I'm not just a name and a number. I'm a human being, and I need this.
Why was it so important for you to come out publicly about your gender identity?
The court-martial process is a very scripted affair. Much of the record of trial is even still classified to this day. And I often felt like, because every day was very scripted, it was very, like we already knew what was going to happen, and I didn't feel like I had a whole lot of agency in that affair. And so finally, once the case was over, I could say definitively, this is who I am.
Do you think that anything has fundamentally altered about US foreign policy, given what you did?
I'm very concerned that there's a difference between knowing something and doing something about it. And I feel that in many instances now, there were things that were not known before that are known to the public, but what we do about it is the thing that I feel like needs to be addressed more. Because now that we do know these things, I don't feel like we're doing anything about it, and that has been more of how I understand that, is that it's not going to change until we actually change it. We can't expect these really broken systems that are going to continue to do these things from changing unless we make them change.
And on broken systems, you've described US politics as being broken. What do you mean by that?
What I mean is that it's no surprise. The way we've set our system up, we demand or require of a single individual an enormous amount of power. And there was always the expectation that was built up over decades that whoever holds this office or position must be benevolent and have the best interests, but those are not requirements of such a position. And I often ask myself, why do we even have a president? Why do we put so much unrestricted power and authority into a single individual and expect them to be not a malevolent figure? And so really, eventually, the kinds of people who would want to be in that position are going to abuse that. And that's one of the reasons why I think I was so troubled by previous administrations increasing the amount of power and authority, regarding surveillance and immigration and law enforcement authority, because this sort of consolidation of power by supposedly benevolent, I'm going to do a good job with these, sets up the system that allows somebody else to come in and use it for evil. We have to ask ourselves whether or not the way that we structure society, the way we structure our government, is sustainable, and whether or not we need to really question the fundamental expectations of these kinds of systems. So we assume that there should be an immigration policy. We assume that there should be a prison system. We assume that there should be a president. We assume that there should be a surveillance apparatus. We assume that there should be an international military presence. I think that these assumptions need to be questioned, and that these assumptions need to be challenged, and that it's not until we really address these things and start to roll back and dismantle many of these authoritarian systems that we assume we need, that we're going to be able to have a better and more peaceful society.
So if US politics is so broken, why did you make a bid for Senate yourself? Did you think that something really could be achieved by that?
I wanted to draw attention to issues. I wanted to use the platform that the American political system has. If you run for political office, you kind of get handed a microphone, and I wanted to say things that I wasn't hearing, people say. Certainly on the political left, Democrats were not saying these things, and I wanted to add a few new ideas, things like abolishing ICE, things like closing down prisons, things like defunding police departments, or removing addressing the school to prison pipeline, or any of these things. They weren't really being addressed. Instead, it was a lot of the same that we were hearing again and again. And I just wanted to add to that. I wanted to give people and let people know that there are other options.
And some of those ideas that you expressed would be considered pretty radical. So abolishing prisons, eliminating national borders. Those are not going to be acceptable in the mainstream anytime soon.
They're options, and they should be options. And the way we've set up our political system, we don't consider these options. I'm just trying to challenge some of these. I was just trying to challenge some of these assumptions that we were making.
Do you think they will ever be palatable to the American mainstream? Is there a way that you could achieve that?
Yes.
How?
By talking about it, by letting people know that these are options, that we don't. Often when I was talking to people, they had just never thought about these things before. It's not until we start to talk about these things and start thinking about change that we can actually achieve that change.
Chelsea, you're also a British national. How much do you follow what's happening politically in the UK, and what do you make of it?
So I followed Brexit very closely, even while I was in prison, and I followed, the rise of nationalism here that led up to that. It's the same, it's very much the same thing that I'm seeing in the States that was happening here. There's an inseparable tie between what's been happening in terms of the rise of US nationalism and UK nationalism, and also nationalist movements throughout Europe. We're seeing a trend towards an increasing amount of policies that really lead up to nothing more than an ethnic cleansing on a pretty frightening scale.
The term ethnic cleansing that you use there is very strong. What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is that anybody that's not from a particular region or an entire group of people, maybe it's based on purely religious, certainly Islam, or it is skin color, or it's where you're from, or what nation you came from or identify as, or anything like that. These sort of trends towards policing this and kicking people out, and then the inevitable conclusion is that you'll never be able to purify your area until you eliminate an entire group of people from that area. And so when we see this happen anywhere in the world, it tends to lead towards genocide. So it's this shifting trend, from talking about xenophobia to executing an ethnic cleansing to actual genocide. And this is a very worrying trend, to say the least.
Can we talk a little bit about tech? Because
Sure.
That is an area of your expertise. It's what you're here to talk about in London. How concerned are you about the power that big tech companies are wielding?
I'm very worried. These are very powerful tools. And they're also tools that inherently have a bias. Artificial intelligence systems and machine learning algorithms are neither good nor bad nor neutral. And that means that whatever values that the person or the organization or institution that is using it are going to be inserted into it. during the design and development process. Certainly with predictive policing, you can end up over-policing entire areas of the population, like we've seen in the US, where it's justified because of a feedback loop that happens within the computer system. And so you have more reporting or more data on a particular group of people, and therefore it predicts that there will be more incidents that happen with this group of people. And we give our data willingly over to to Facebook and Twitter, who then sell it to advertisers. But those aren't the only people who are buying the data, as we saw with Cambridge Analytica and many of these other, these kinds of things are going to intensify and they're going to worsen.
And in terms of Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, we've seen a stark example of misuse of data. Who should be regulating these companies? Do you trust government to do it?
I don't, because government systems are also prone to these kinds of things. And I think that there needs to be much more public accountability.
How would that work then?
Well, there's different ways in which you can do it. From the perspective of developers, at least, those of us who know how to build these systems and know how to work these systems, we have an ethical obligation to understand the consequences of a system that we're designing and building. And I think that there should be a process in which we have an ethical code of conduct in which we take the time to analyze what the consequences of a particular system are going to be before we even get to building it in the first place.
Most people, though, don't have the expert knowledge of technology. So how can they hold these companies, these actors, accountable?
We, as the users, can withhold our data. Encryption helps with that. Using anonymizing software helps with that. There's different ways and approaches, but I think that there are going to be more and better approaches to doing this. I think it's always a good reminder to have an understanding of the fact that whenever you're signing up for a free service online, chances are it's not really free because you're what's being, and you and your data are what's being exchanged here.
So you've already dabbled in electoral politics. Do you see yourself doing that again in future?
I haven't decided whether or not that's the case. Certainly, it's not where I'm focused on right now. I am hopeful that perhaps in the upcoming elections in the U.S. Can start to. We certainly have voices who have differing opinions now. We are certainly starting to see younger people in politics now, and that's promising. But really, most of the work is going to happen in communities and on the ground. And so I do think that electoral politics is not the only game in town.
Chelsea Manning, thank you very much.
Thank you.